I want to talk about retirement, specifically retirement for people who are ministers, clergy. I'm a retired Episcopal priest, been retired about 12 years. First of all, it appears to me that there are kind of three stages of retirement. You can begin with the process of how you get to retirement. There are usually two ways. You can either plan it and carry out the plan, or you just have to be retired at some point because events coalesce in such a way that you retire, and you weren't quite expecting it at that moment anyway. And then the first thing that happens is, at least for us clergy, is that we are part of the church, and so we're no longer the center of a worshiping community in quite the same way. That's one of the things that happens in retirement for clergy. And what that means is that we often are doing supply work, which means we're functioning on Sundays at least. And sometimes we're priest in charge, or might even be doing an interim for someone, some group. Anyway, generally, most of us eventually settle into where we're going to be. It's usually not where we have been. My last diocese was Diocese of Wyoming. Now I'm in the Diocese of West Missouri, Kansas City in particular, where I have lived before. So I have many acquaintances in the area. Anyway, there are three stages of retirement. The first is an active stage where you transition. You're probably doing a similar job, but truncated in a number of ways. One doesn't have as much authority. One is not, as I say, the center of a worshiping community. And then at some point, that becomes a bit much, and one decides not to do that. Maybe one continues with supply work on Sundays, but not much else. Usually that's, for most of us, that's when we approach the age of 80 or so, which for me will be next year. And then we don't have quite an active, now we're not dead. We're still stimulated to do things. We have, most of us, I think, are readers, and we have a lot of information, and there are things that we can do. The third stage is probably a stage of gathering disability, which is gathering already, but it comes to the point where it becomes sort of right in your face, and one is more of in survival mode. So, three stages. Now, one of the things that I think I found lacking in my retirement time is that there were no clear guidelines. I remember that, and I remember it partly from bad examples in my own life, but when you resign from a congregation, you leave that congregation. The guidelines around that are fairly specific. There's usually a period of time, at least a year, where you're just not part of that congregation any longer. And if you're asked to be part of that congregation, you have to be asked through the person who is now the leader. So the rector, vicar, whatever, dean, whoever's the head of the congregation. Once you've resigned, you have to be invited in, and you have to be careful about maintaining any kind of relationship. After a year or so, you can reappear. Most some congregations are very open about inviting a retired person in and to be active in many ways. However, there are no guidelines really about this, and there should be. I think it should be clear that whatever one does in a congregation should be pretty much under the approval of the leader of that congregation. As retired people, we still have lots of energy, and we also have lots of interest in helping out as much as we can. But there need to be clear boundaries, and it's mostly communication between the rector, the vicar, the priest in charge, whoever is the head of the congregation. The retired person needs to communicate with that person, and also that head of congregation needs to communicate with the retired person. Mid-career clergy, who, if you happen to be part of a large congregation, you're led by somebody who's probably been a priest for a while, maybe 10, 15 years. And that person, they tend to be kind of competitive when they think about other clergy. They see other clergy as competition. Now, most retired clergy are not competition. That's not what I don't certainly want it. And most retired clergy that I know don't want that. We're not really direct competitors. We're not trying to one-up the leader of the congregation. But there should be some particular guidelines. You don't gossip behind the head of the congregation's back, for instance. You just don't do that. Because if you do, it creates a faction, or it can. And that's not helpful, because the leader of the congregation's responsibility centrally is the community itself. And mid-career clergy, while they may look at other clergy as competition, they also see them as the possibility of causing some difficulty. Certainly that is the reality when we resign from a congregation and we move on to another cure, another congregation. At that point, meddling in the old congregation is a no-no. And just about anything can be seen as meddling. So distancing, saying our goodbyes and holding off, and then reminding if someone asks us to do a pastoral thing like a wedding or a funeral, that has to be through the leadership of the worshiping community, because after all, that's a pastoral opportunity for the leader, the new leader especially. But those kind of guidelines are not really there, and they should be. I think dioceses should treat retired clergy somewhat like they treat deacons and people who've resigned from the congregation. There should be some sort of clear ideas of what should happen. For the most part, there is none, and there is a tendency, at least here in West Missouri, of leaders of congregations not dealing directly with retired clergy. Now, I don't know why that is. Just then it's a bad idea. You know, if there's somebody who you think might cause you some difficulty, then sit down and talk to them, find out what's going on. Now, a retired clergy person is retired and so is not particularly interested in taking anything over. And especially if they've moved on to sort of the second stage of retirement, which is less active, and we'll be glad to do something if we're invited to do it, but more or less have to be invited. And if we sort of offer ourselves to it, it needs to be with the understanding that the leader of the congregation can veto it. If I remember at predecessor to the present rector of my home congregation, I was helping out with a young adult group, and he asked me to remove myself from that. I was retired, and that was fine with me. He felt like they had other things going on, and that I wasn't probably as helpful as I would like to have been. That's fine. It was good to have his input. But he said it to me directly. There wasn't any sort of, indirect communication about it. He just said, I think maybe this is not a good idea for you. And I said, okay. The rector of a congregation, the priest in charge, whoever is the leader of that congregation, that person is the one that we take our cues from as retired clergy. At least that should be a guideline. And if we ourselves would like to be involved in doing things with and for the congregation, then we ought to be able to present that to the leader of the congregation. And I mean, if it's not outside the programming and the direction that the leader of the congregation thinks is appropriate, then we'll let her rip. Sadly, many of the clear message of my home congregation to retired clergy was, well, go ahead, sit in the pew, but be quiet. We don't want you to agitate politically. We don't want you to do anything, really. Well, that's kind of a waste of resources, and it's also, some of us are good at some things. Anyway, so that's it. 3 stages of 2 ways you can get to retirement, and 3 stages of retirement itself, and guidelines for dealing with the congregation you might attend if you're no longer doing supply or priest in charge or any of those things that retired clergy sometimes do. Anyway, Blessings. Have a good day.